Monster Professor.
Welcome to the Monster Professor, a show in which we discuss and explore monsters in literature, myth, film, games, folklore, culture, and beyond. I'm your host, Josh Woods, author, editor, professor, and monster expert. A few housekeeping notes to get out of the way first. The Monster Professor episodes have been coming out once every 2 weeks. We went for once a week for a long time, several months, and then once every 2 weeks for quite a while. It's coming up on a year. Can you believe that? It seems crazy to me that it's already been about a year of Monster Professor episodes. So now it's kind of shifting into a new realm, one I'm really excited about, in which more of the episodes are going to involve my getting to talk with somebody else about monsters and or those people's careers in the monster world in one way or another. And so as I'm setting up those interviews, those kinds of things take a lot more time than just my own sitting down in front of the mic and talking about monsters. So there might be some weeks in which you don't get a Monster Professor episode once every 2 weeks like clockwork as it has been. You might go 3 weeks and then get one, or you might get a couple faster than that. So this is a great time to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already, wherever you listen to it on, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, Stitcher, all sorts of Podcast Republic, all sorts of places. Oh, also on iHeartRadio now. I forgot to mention that. Recently picked up not only on Spotify but iHeartRadio, because as soon as the episodes pop up, whenever it does, you don't have to remember to check for it. If you subscribe, it'll just pop up for you. So look into that and be prepared for a possibility of infrequent episodes. If that makes you mad and you want to turn into a monster and send me some hate messages or hate mail, I can take it. Go ahead and blow off some steam and send your hate. Some of you have already yelled at me for going to once every 2 weeks, but I promise you it's going to be worth it, because I've got some really amazing interviews lined up with people who you'd think wouldn't dare speak with the likes of me, and yet they're excited about it, and you know I am. I'm not going to tell you which people yet or what kind of subjects are coming up. You'll just have to wait and see. All right. So next housekeeping note, I very often, as you already know, use my platform to promote my own books. Imagine that, because I don't have any sponsors. Now, if you got me some sponsors or give me some money, then I'll get stuff out frequently, but I might as well plug my own stuff. I had a book recently come out, my book of stories, my debut book of short stories, Oh Monstrous World, published this year by the prestigious and wonderful Press 53. Well, that book, A Monstrous World, just won the International Book Awards in the category of fiction short story. So those books that are collections of short stories from all over the world. I don't know how many dozens, if not hundreds of entries they got, but Oh Monstrous World was the award winner. There was only one. And I thought that was really surprising and excellent to find out. I want to give just a moment some love out to the finalists who were also in the fiction short story category. So books to definitely check out. If you're listening to this one, you're probably already aware of mine, but some of the other ones that were finalists for the International Book Awards. Nancy Gerber's book, A Way Out of Nowhere Stories. There's another one from Christopher Fielden, The Book of the Bloodless, Volume 1, Alternative Afterlives. Brett London has a book called Bulwark. Gail Priest, Eastern Shore Shorts. Miriam Pirabi, or I just butchered that name. Pirbhai. Oh, Miriam's going to hate me. But anyway, I'm plugging your book. So, Outside People and Other Stories. And stories that are short, Volume 1, a collection of 5-minute short stories to read before turning on the TV by Ashmoy Prolance. And so those are some further books to check out. Also, I know, by the way, the winner of the International Book Award for Poetry. That is a book called Confessions of a Barefaced Woman by Red Hen Press, published recently. And that's by the poet Allison Joseph at SIUC. So congratulations. I mean, you've got books coming in from all over the world by fantastic writers. And it is no joke, this competition, man. It is a serious competition. And to be the winner of that thing is quite an accomplishment. So congrats to Allison Joseph. Among other winners, I thought I should mention that somebody else who won in his category of book was Pope Francis. so I think it was like inspirational books or religious books or something. I forget the exact category now. But I think that makes this officially the first time, and I imagine the last time, that the Monster Professor Josh Woods and Pope Francis will be on the same list of anything. I hope so, unless we both end up on the excommunicated list or something. I don't know. I wonder if he'd come on the podcast to talk about exorcisms. I do want to get a real exorcist on the podcast at some point soon. Okay, I'm getting way off track now. So for this episode, I didn't think it was going to be that long of an episode. It might not be, but I've thought that before, so we'll see. I want to talk about Sirens and Mermaids. Alright, it's an odd one that I would go to because there are so many that have so many other monster subjects that have hefty requests. Angels and demons, I think, is probably they're probably the most heavily requested one. But I've got to do that right because there's so much I want to say about angels and so much about demons. Both of them need their own episodes and just piles and piles of reference books and notes. That's going to take a while to do right. Cthulhu, the same thing, or maybe I should say Cthulhu. I need to do one on him, but man, oh man, I before I do, I want to reread everything. So some of the most requested ones are going to wait. And why in the world Sirens and Mermaids? I don't exactly know, but for those of you who listened to the previous episode, and if you haven't, you really need to check it out. It was a conversation with Joseph Nigg, the fantastic, the fabulous author of Fabulous Beasts, among other, many other monster books, books about fabulous beasts throughout history. Afterward, we were chatting back and forth over email about the different subjects that we both wanted to get to but never did, one of them being sea creatures. And we both have stories in which we were at the ocean and were terrified by something we saw in there. And so maybe I'll wait and reveal his if I get a chance to talk with him again, because he has a really fantastic one. In my own story, I was out on a fishing boat with my dad and my brother as a kid, and we got out past the sight of land. And I didn't think that was going to be that big of a deal. You're just on a boat on the water. No big deal, whether you see the shore or not, until I was out past the side of the land. And then I thought, oh God. It was like this deep existential horror, like the kid that falls off the boat in Moby Dick, and then they're in the middle of the whale chase, so they just leave him. They're like, we'll pick him up later. and then they go off past the horizon from where he can see. They do eventually go back and pick him up, and he's right there, but he's like absolutely traumatized and like unblinking and unspeaking for the rest of his life. He went insane out there in that existential emptiness. My reaction wasn't quite that bad, but something close to it. I realized it's horrifying to no longer see any land anywhere. And then I started worrying. I'm a kid at this point, but I'm worrying, are there even laws here? Does the captain have the right to just start murdering us and throwing us off the side? Would anyone ever find our bodies anyway? And I look off the side of the boat, and down there I see a jellyfish, and it's rising to the surface. I see this clearly in my mind. There's no way I could have seen it in real life the way I see it in my memory or that I saw it as a kid. I'm admitting that right now. But this jellyfish was the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. This thing was humongous. If I were to have fallen off of the edge of this boat onto this jellyfish, it would just absorb me and swallow me, and it would eat my soul as well. I was just certain of this. It was horrifying. And so ever since, anything relating to the ocean, in one way or another, is terrifying to me, because they are alien creatures. I mean, they are freaking alien-ish anyway. And so I don't remember the exact chain of thoughts, and then it got me around recently to and thinking about beasts or animals that lure you in, and then you have to go to the siren. And what's up with the siren and the mermaid? Well, a lot of strict modern monster experts, I guess, or maybe amateur experts, would say that those two are very different things. A mermaid and a siren are two very different. The siren is this sea witch, sea nymph thing from classical mythology, Greek, Roman mythology, that lure sailors to their deaths with their songs and their exotic or erotic allure. And mermaids are a completely different race of creatures, merfolk, mermen, and mermaids, and they have upper body humanoid, lower body porpoise or fish-like, and that's completely different. Well, okay, fair enough, maybe, but the thing is, for the longest time, those two, among other ideas like undines and sea witches, and we'll get to some more in a minute, but for the longest time, those two things were interchanged all the time. You'll find some authoritative sources saying that the mermaid was an entirely humanoid creature, legs and all, who was simply aquatic, and it wasn't until the medieval era that artists and crest makers would confuse them with the half-fish sirens of classical mythology. And then other authoritative sources will say the exact opposite, that the siren was the fully humanoid thing, and then not until the medieval era where they confused or mixed with the half-fish mermaid type of thing. I think it's safe to say that we mix the two because both of them are beautiful and they're treacherous. And also, why not talk about the mermen, or why not talk about the gill men, like Abe Sapien or The Shape of Water or The Creature from the Black Lagoon? I want to save that for its own episode on gill men and fishmen. Because they're different. They really are different. You don't get the same kinds of stories or sightings throughout history and throughout folklore and mythology that you do when they're female. There's something essentially distinct there. So if you're thinking, what do you mean sightings throughout history? Let me give you let's do a quick rundown of some famous ones. Probably the most famous of the... papers flying everywhere. I've got notes here. Sorry for the noise. One of the most famous sightings is probably from Henry Hudson's log. This is the Hudson that was the explorer of large parts of Canada, North America, like Hudson himself. So 1608, and in the summer of 1608, we get the exact point on planet Earth where they are in leagues. And we get this note that here's Henry Hudson. This morning, one of our company looking overboard saw a mermaid. And calling up some of the company to see her, one more came up, and by that time she was come close to the ship's side, looking earnestly on the men. A little after, a sea came and overturned her. A sea was one of their terms for a large wave, like a big wave came. So a little after, a big wave came and overturned her. From the navel upward, her back and breasts were like a woman, as they say that saw her, her body as big as one of us, her skin very white, and long hair hanging down behind, of color black. In her going down they saw her tail, which was like the tail of a porpoise, and speckled like a mackerel. Their names that saw her were Thomas Hills and Robert Rayner. That was 1608. You've got sightings, say, in, let's see, was it it was Scotland in 1811. He had seen a mermaid. Who was it? John Isaac, sworn testimony. You don't tend to swear testimony on things you're not prepared to die over, the truth over. Not back in the day. He gave this description. Let's see. She had red hair. Her skin was white. Above the waist, but below the waist, reddish gray. And she was on a rock, sitting on a rock above the water. And then he watched her for a moment, and then she dove into the water. And then later on, two more came and testified that they'd seen her, Catherine Lochanan, among others. Let's see, 1809, William Monroe. 18 to 14, a couple of fishermen. 1949, a couple of sightings off of Cape Moore. And the most interesting, I think, is one that Borges talks about, or a couple that Borges talks about. In which not only is the mermaid sighted, but town records indicate that the mermaids became citizens of the towns. I kid you not. I'm not messing with you on that. So here is what Borges says about it, and then quotes. Okay. And this is from, by the way, Jorge Luis Borges' essay, Narrative Art and Magic, which is one of, I was going to say one of his most brilliant, but they're all brilliant essays. So just read all of Borges. You've heard that enough from me. There you go. All right. And it's a footnote in a footnote kind of thing. He does that kind of thing. He says in the 6th century, a siren was captured and baptized in northern Wales. Captured and baptized. And she became a saint. In certain ancient almanacs, they list her under the name Mergen. Another, 1403, they had a dike in Harlem, and there was an opening in the dike, and she passed through and ended up in their lock there. And she stayed there until the day of her death. Now, he says nobody understood her, but they taught her to weave, and she worshipped as if by instinct the cross. And then later on, 16th century, a chronicler argued this kind of logic, now get ready, that she could not have been a fish because she knew how to weave, and she could not have been a woman because she lived in the water. And so there's your evidence for that one having been a mermaid. Another one he tells us, named Parthenope, was found near Campania, and her name was given to the city. Now the city is just called Naples, but at one point it was named after Parthenope. And geographer Strabo saw her tomb, and he wrote about having witnessed the Olympic Games and the torch races that they have periodically to celebrate her, to remember her, because she was a great, having been a mermaid or siren, was a great citizen of the town, I suppose. And so those are at least some of the historical notes about the sirens and the mermaids, and the people who gather these notes point out that the details about the sightings are pretty consistent. They are across the northern Atlantic, and a whole lot of them off of, say, Scotland and Ireland, but also other places, but typically northern Atlantic are where the reports come from. The skin tends to be white from the waist up. The hair seems to be colored as normal hair. They tend to be topless women, and the bottom from the waist down tends to be fish-like, but actually porpoise-like, in which the fins are turned to line up with the hips rather than going vertical like fish. So all those scales are reported. And a lot of them end up being reports, like sworn testimonies and reports by people whose jobs would be on their line for giving false report or starting trouble or pulling pranks. And a lot of them come from people who would not necessarily have been drunk at the time. And I mention all of that because I think the common explanation for these kinds of sightings showing up in the chronicles and logs are that they're really drunk sailors or really lonely sailors who have seen manatee-like things. And okay, fair enough, maybe when you see a manatee, it is a little bit strange, but that's a weird type. If you've ever seen one, it's a weird type of creature to confuse with, say, a beautiful half-naked woman sitting on the rocks and perhaps even singing. In fact, it's so much of a non-explanation that I think it doesn't even try to explain it. That's like saying that you didn't see an alien spacecraft, you just saw like a bluebird. That's not even trying to explain it. They're so different. And so those don't necessarily hold up, but I'm not making an argument for or against the existence of them. I mean, I'm just thinking, how cool is it that they have this one, that they have a mermaid in their lock, and so they decide to teach her to weave, and she does it fine, and they have a good life with her in town. That's pretty freaking cool. Sirens of the past, I guess we should go back to, say, first Jason and the Argonauts. They had to pass through some sirens, and they didn't do the Odysseus trick where they try to block up their ears. We'll talk about that in a second. But for Jason and his crew, he had Orpheus with him, the greatest musician to have ever lived, the one who went down into Tartarus to rescue his love. And he won over Hades by his music, by his performance. And so Jason wanted Orpheus to cancel them out and sing over top of them. So William Morris, in The Life and Death of Jason, wrote about this in beautiful ways. And when the crew first gets a glimpse of the sirens on the rocks, he says, "For they were near enow to see the gusty wind of evening blow long locks of hair across those bodies white, with golden spray hiding some dear delight." And as Orpheus is called upon to sing over top of the sirens so that their alluring song wouldn't have the effect on the crew that the sirens were, trying to lure them out of the ship or lure them, in theory, to their deaths, maybe. The sirens are calling to they promise this like everlasting paradise or peace, or like the sleepy paradise-like existence that in which they can go under the water with them and live, as he says, roofed over by the changeful sea. Isn't that an amazing line? Roofed over by the changeful sea. And so instead, Orpheus sings of the grandeur of living on the land and of terra firma. And so it's the song of the sea versus the song of the land, to try to get the men to remember why they don't need to drown themselves or try to live on the sea or under the sea. And it works, and it gets them through, all except for once they're past it, one of the crew jumps up and he can't take it anymore, and he runs past everybody on the deck toward the back of the deck, and he leaps off. And then that's the last they ever saw of him. So the Sirens ended up getting one of the crew. In the Odyssey, Odysseus was warned about taking his crew through these paths, but it's like he didn't have much of a choice. You choose one terrible path in which the rocks move around on you and will grind up your ship and you'll all die, or you take another path between this horrible typhoon and a horrible monster caught in between a rock and a hard place, or Charybdis and a hard place. So you have, and in that, the path he chooses, he has to go through the Sirens. But Circe warns him. She says, you can get through it if you have all your crew plug up their ears with beeswax. But you'll kind of want to hear it too, so you can get the benefit of hearing it and not leaping to your death toward them. What you do is tie yourself to the mast, let everybody else plug up their ears. And so that's what Odysseus does. And you kind of wonder, what does he get to hear? Well, Homer tells us ever so briefly. He tells us exactly what it was, and it's not what you would expect. It's not exactly like the siren song that Jason and the Argonauts hear, in which they promise this like sleepy paradise under the water, which might be another way of saying like the wonderful slumber of death, or the euphoria of drowning and washing away the cares of the world. In the Odyssey, it's different. Here's part of the song from Book 12, and this is Pope's translation, the Song of the Sirens. Till now none sailed this way, but stopped to hear our honeyed accent warbled in his ear, but felt his soul with pleasing raptures thrilled, but found his mind with stores of knowledge filled. We know whate'er the kings of mighty name achieved at Ilion in the field of fame, whatever beneath the sun's bright journey lies, oh stay and learn new wisdom from the wise. They're luring out Odysseus with promise of complete knowledge, or promise of wisdom and knowledge. They know everything that has happened in the world. They even know of his own feats at Ilium in the Battle of Troy, or the war. And they know all things that have existed, and all you have to do is stay and you'll learn all things. And so they're not alluring him with sex, or they're not alluring him with a promise of like unconsciousness, as it might seem, since they are like water-like creatures. And at least for Jung and others, the water and the deeps are like this unconsciousness, or the weird kind of unknowing slumber but peace of unconsciousness, and that consistent lure that you'll have. But in the Odyssey, instead, it's conscious knowledge. It's even more knowledge. And that's what's tempting Odysseus, at least. Or at least that's what he hears. And that makes you wonder if they tailor their song specifically for him, knowing that he's the only one who can hear them. And that's a really fascinating idea. And ever since we have this idea of a siren, connecting that with song, even our word siren, like the actual piece of equipment on an ambulance, for instance, actually just is just a way of going from, say, Latin and Old French to French to English. It really just is coming from the classical myth of the siren. So that's where we get our word siren. And mermaids are essentially back and forth mixed in here as well. Except in addition to singing, mermaids are very often associated with storms, in that if you're a sailor and you hear a mermaid song or you hear a strange song out there on the sea, that means a storm is coming. And it was never quite clear whether the mermaids create the storm with their song, or they just know a storm is going to come and they sing about it as in preparation. In fact, I forget who was mentioning the medieval thinkers and chroniclers and monks would have these debates in their letters and in their books, trying to figure out whether mermaids create the storms or whether mermaids predict the storms. And the controversy was never sorted out. And so we'll just never know. Connected with these, I think, are the idea of these water spirits and these water nymphs. They're always female, or almost always female. And one of them is the Undine. Now, the Undine is one of 4 elemental creatures, or 4 elementals, listed by the famous alchemist Paracelsus, who claimed to have created a homunculus who supposedly extended his life into the many hundreds of years. And he said that the 4 elements that we have in Western culture, earth, fire, wind, water, they're very different elements elsewhere, farther east. But of the 4 elements, each one has a spirit or elemental that is its embodiment and in some way is, say, the manager of that element or the chief of that element. And so for water, you have the Undine or the Ondine. The others, very briefly, are for earth, you have the gnome. For air, you have the sylphs. And for fire, you have the salamander, which is pretty cool. And the undines and this idea of a sea witch or a nymph and a siren and a mermaid, there's no clear direct line between all of them. There is a related one, because there is a related one called the Selkie, which also shows up along the North Atlantic as well, which, by the way, is a place that you never get any manatees or sea cows or anything like that. And so that as an explanation of what drunk and lonely sailors are seeing falls apart even more. It's almost more reasonable to say they saw mermaids than it is to say that they saw manatees up in the cold North Atlantic waters and thought that they were beautiful women. Anyway, the Selkie was this a woman who would turn into a seal. And all the folklore, Scottish folklore primarily, but all sorts of other Northern European cultures had these stories, and actually Northern Indigenous American cultures had these same kind of stories too, in which they were were creatures or aquatic creatures in which the people would turn into seals. And in the folklore, it's a woman, and in the story, it's almost always, in the various stories, that almost always involves a child somehow of the Selkie. And so some regular, like, landlubber guy ends up tricking or forcing this magical woman into marrying him by stealing her seal coat. or in some way her seal coat is hidden from her, and so she can't go back to her true nature. And so she's stuck and trapped on land until the day she finally retrieves her seal coat, puts it on, and gets to return to her home in the sea. And it's kind of a horrifying but beautiful type of picture in the mind. And then she almost always leaves behind children, and they have like little hints. They're either destined to become Selkies themselves and find their own seal coats, or they're little hints that they are half Selkie in that they have webbed fingers or webbed toes. Plenty of explanations, medical and cultural and otherwise, for this Selkie stories, but there's some connection between that. I would say not only do we have the aquatic half animal female figure in these stories, but there's something about the allure and the capture and the curse of this whole like love between men and women thing going on. And you get that in Hans Christian Andersen's story, The Little Mermaid, too, which of course the Disney Corporation made into a movie back in the days in the 90s. 80s or 90s or something. But those of you who are familiar with the Hans Christian Andersen version know how much more brutal it is, in which she wants, the Little Mermaid wants not only the love of this prince that she saw and that she actually rescued without getting any credit for it, but she wants a human soul, because she learns when mermaids die, they just turn into sea foam. But when humans die, their souls get to live eternally. And she wants that soul, and so she ends up making a deal with a sea witch in which she has to hand over her beautiful voice for a pair of legs and the ability to stay on land. And if she gets the love of the prince, she'll get a human soul. And so what and by the way, when she can also dance wonderfully well, that's part of the thing. But as with all witches, the sea witch is no different. She always puts in a little twist, and she's like, oh, by the way, your feet are always going to feel as if you're being stabbed through the soles with knives, and your feet will constantly bleed uncontrollably. You'll be in constant pain, horrible pain. That's horrifying. But Hans Christian Andersen kind of reversed the story, that instead of the men or the sailors being drawn out to some type of doom by the song of the mermaid, instead you take away the song of the mermaid and you draw the mermaid out of the sea onto the land. It's a horrible story, and she doesn't get the love of the prince, but in the very end, when she commits despairing suicide by stabbing herself, she doesn't turn back into sea foam. Instead, she turns into an airy spirit and is lifted up. And so that's an indication that she did get her soul all along, because she didn't do horrible things like murder and all of the other temptations that she could have gotten to get the love of the prince. So it's kind of a last minute happy ending to an otherwise really upsetting and sad story. The genius storyteller Mike Mignola, by the way, who created the Hellboy comic books, has one short story within the Hellboy world in which Hellboy is captured by these three mermaids who take him to the sea witch, mermaid witch, the Bog Rouge. And they play this wish-granting game that ends up being and she plans to murder Hellboy as well, and it's like an even darker take on the Hans Christian Andersen Little Mermaid story. And mermaids also show up there, in which King Vold, this headless god-like figure that rides at night with his demonic spirit wolves on hunts for mystical creatures. He has Hellboy like watch his wolves for him against Hellboy's will. But if King Vold comes by and tells you you have to do something, you're his serf, and you just have to do it, no matter who you are. And then he comes back and he has a mermaid slung over the back of his horse. He has been out mermaid hunting and he has killed one. With some indication that it's a revenge killing as well as a hunt. My goodness, I thought it was going to be like an extra short episode. I don't know, like 20 minutes, but here we are up to 40 minutes yet again, talking about mermaids. And I was going to bring some mermaids up in some video games where they show up in much cooler ways than one might expect. But maybe I've thrown enough at you. Maybe you have some cool ideas now that you can play with as far as sirens, mermaids, undines, even silkies go. So if you made it this far, you survived another episode of The Monster Professor. Good job. And again, go ahead and subscribe. Don't get too mad if it doesn't come out like clockwork once every 2 weeks for a while. It will for sometimes, it might not other times, but it's going to be worth it because we have some fantastic conversations and interviews coming up with some people you're going to love to hear from. So with all that said, I'll talk to you next time on The Monster Professor.